Studio One has two main VSTs for programming drums, Sample One and Impact. Both are great, but they each have their own strengths and weaknesses, so today I want to share the pros and cons of each so that you can make a better decision. Before we start, if you're a Studio One user, don't forget to download my free productivity toolbar. This is a macro toolbar that sits at the top of your timeline and combines a bunch of Studio One production functions into time-saving one-click buttons. The productivity toolbar is completely free, so if you want to start speeding up your Studio One workflow today, then make sure to click the first link down below to get access. Also, this video will be a part of a much bigger Studio One production course that I am currently putting together, so if you want to be notified of when that drops, then definitely get subscribed and stay tuned. Okay, so here in front of me, I have both Impact XT on my left and then Sample One XT on my right. If you're brand new to Studio One, then Impact is essentially the native drum machine, while Sample One is the native sampler. Now, at first glance, you might look at this and think that the answer to this is quite simple and choose Impact because after all, it is a native drum machine, but as you'll see, Impact does come with a few limitations depending on your workflow and the type of music that you like to make. If we take a closer look at Impact, we can see that it places all of its samples on different pads, which are then assigned to different notes or pitches on the piano roll. This structure ultimately means that all of your drums will live inside one MIDI event, with each drum sample assigned to a specific note. Depending on your workflow and your intentions, this could be good or bad. To start programming drums, simply load your samples by dragging them over from the browser into each pad, and then create a MIDI event by double-clicking on the Impact track from the timeline. From here, you can either start to draw them in by hand on either the drum view or the piano roll view, or if you have a MIDI controller like the Atom, you can start to record them in manually by finger drumming. Impact goes even further though, because if you wanted more of an FL Studio kind of workflow, then instead of a regular MIDI event, which would normally bring up the piano roll, you can add a pattern event that brings up the built-in step sequencer, and you could add your drums in that way. Now to bring up the pattern editor in Studio One, you basically have a couple of different options. Option one, click the Option key on your keyboard on a Mac, whatever the PC equivalent for that is as well. Double click on the timeline and then you get the pattern editor. The second option is to go over to the top to where it says Event, Instrument Parts, Insert Pattern, right? You could also assign a keyboard shortcut to this, or if you have my free productivity macro toolbar, then you could just simply go over to the top and hit the Insert Pattern button. But okay, to fully demonstrate this, let me go ahead and just create a very simple pattern for you here real quick. So let me do a hi-hat here on every second step. Then let's do a kick on the first, and then a clap here on every third beat, which is the 9th step, and we get this. Impact is fantastic, but as mentioned, it does come with some drawbacks. For one, if you make hip-hop and specifically trap music, you won't be able to raise or lower the pitch of your hi-hats or snares. Pitching your hats and snares is a really common technique in hip-hop and pop music, but because all of your drum samples live in one MIDI event, with each sample assigned to a note on the piano roll, attempting to pitch any sample will result in changing the sample completely. Another drawback is that although it is easy to get started, Impact does require some manual work on the back end if you want to separate your drums in the console in order to add plugins to each sample individually. To demonstrate, let's take the pattern that we programmed earlier, and let's say that I wanted to add plugins to each sample. To start the process, what you would have to do is first assign each pad to a different channel by clicking on the bottom right of the pad here and then changing the output. So let's go ahead and do this real quick. Pad 1 will of course be stereo out 1, pad 2 will be stereo out 2, 3 to 3, and then since I only have 4 samples and 4 pads used, then 4 to 4. Now, in most cases, once you go through this process of assigning each pad to a channel, you will also automatically be creating the channels in the console, as you can see here. Now, if that does not happen for you, then no worries. All you basically have to do is go to the top drop-down menu here, this little arrow, drop that down, and then make sure you check the channels that you want to see active. Now, there is a way to bypass all of this by creating a custom default Impact preset, and I'll make a dedicated video for that showing you how to do it, but these extra steps are something that you will have to consider. Now, once you have your channels here, then of course you can go ahead and start adding your different plugins and then affect these in any way that you want. The last consideration when using Impact is that it also requires additional work if you want to separate your drum samples into multiple tracks for further arrangement control. Because they are all initially in one MIDI event, you would first have to convert to a piano roll part if you started with a step sequencer pattern and then separate that by pitch. Let me show you how to do that real quickly. So here I have that pattern that we created demonstrated earlier, if I wanted to separate this into different tracks, I would first have to right click, go over to instrument parts, convert pattern to part. That converts it into a piano roll part. So there it is. From there, I would have to go back again, right click, go over to instrument parts, go over to explode pitches to tracks, which is right here. And then finally, we get all of those sounds separated by pitch, which is also by sample. Now, another really easy way to do this, of course, is if you have my free productivity toolbar, you could just click on this and hit separate pattern, and it does the exact same thing. Finally, once you have this here, the last thing that I would recommend you do is that you pair each track to its respective channel, so that way you could use the inspector window here to also add your effects to each sample simply by clicking over to each track. Because right now, if you notice, they're all assigned to channel 1. So basically what I would have to do is click on the first track, which is a kick, impact 1, that's right. Go over to the clap, which I believe was actually 2. Let me double click here, check. Clap was 2, so impact stereo out 2, and then 3 was the impact stereo out 3, and then there we go. Now you're all set to go to add all of your plugins straight from the inspector window, and you have full separation in case you wanted to maneuver these events individually in the timeline. Now, the cool thing about also assigning each of these tracks to their specific channels is that once you do that, you'll also be able to move these tracks freely, independently of each other, because if you don't separate them here by channel, then by default, they will be stuck together. This is something that I actually just learned here, so good tip for you. So that was Impact, but now let's take a closer look at Sample 1. So Sample 1, as mentioned, is the native sampler, and the main difference from Impact is that instead of loading samples into pads and then having each pad be an individual note, here, the sample that you load will be spread across a keyboard. So here I have a snare sample. And as you can see, it basically takes that sample and stretches it across the keyboard so you can play multiple pitches of that same sample. By design, this is the VST that you should be using for 808s, because with those, you want to be able to play multiple notes from one just 808 sample. Aside from 808s, however, many people also use it for regular drums, and the main reason, as you can probably already tell, is that because it spreads samples across the keyboard, which allows for sample pitching. So to demonstrate this, let me go ahead and go over to the MIDI event for this track, which is a snare track. And then for this, I will be using my other toolbar, the Beatmaker's toolbar. Let's go ahead and program a clap on 2 and 4. Right, so if I wanted to pitch any of these up or down, it's as simple as taking any note, dragging it up, and dragging it down. And there you go. Another benefit of using Sample 1 is that because you will need a new instance for each drum sound, bringing in a new instance also auto-creates console channels and tracks for each sound, giving you the flexibility and control straight from the start. So just to show you this really quickly, I'm going to bring in a new Sample 1. So let's go ahead and drag it over. Let me look for it. Here it is. Simple as drag and drop. And let's call this one Test, just so we can identify it on the console. And then once I bring up the console, you can see that it is right here, Test. A channel was automatically created for me. Finally, when using Sample 1, it is also possible to layer sounds by stacking them under the sample section here. So let me show you that real quick. So right now I have a snare loaded on this Sample 1, but I could just as simply drag in, let's say, a clap, and then layer both of these together. Super useful. As an added bonus, and this is really a pro level workflow tip for you, if you drag in a sample into Sample 1 from a folder that contains similar sounds, say like a snare, you could switch between these samples by simply clicking on these little arrows here. So to demonstrate here, I have a snare that I brought in from a snare folder that is in my hard drive. Because that snare belongs to that folder, I can easily use these arrows at the top to switch to the next one. So as you can see, the first one is called the Roll Snare Mod, the one we're using. If I hit the right arrow, I go to the next one, Snare Casters, next one, Snare I, next one, Guess Who, so on and so forth. So as you can see, hot swapping in Sample 1 just becomes really effective and easy if you have the right folder set up. Now, as far as the downsides for Sample 1, well, for one, we have an increased CPU usage technically because you will essentially be using a new instance for every sample. It's not by a lot though, because Studio One handles CPU quite well, I think, but it is something to consider depending on your computer. Finally, because all the samples are on different instances, it's not as easy to finger drum as you would with Impact XT. So that was a brief brief comparison between Impact XT and Sample One XT for drum programming in Studio One. Personally, as of late, I've been using Sample One for all of my drums because to me, the biggest deal breaker with Impact, aside from not being able to pitch my samples, is that I cannot make arrangement decisions on the fly. If I use Impact and have all my drums in one MIDI event, I would have to double click on that event and then change the pattern by manually adding or removing notes if I wanted to create a drum change. In contrast, if everything was separated from the start, I could easily delete entire events from the timeline, which would only contain one sound, without having to open up anything, and that way make arrangement decisions on the fly and keep the momentum going. At the end of the day, this is a highly personal decision that should depend on not only your workflow, but also the type of music that you make. Despite which method you decide to choose though, once you have things figured out and start finishing up some music, you might want to distribute it, and if that's the case, then consider doing it with today's video sponsor, DistroKid. DistroKid is a digital music distributor and what I think is not only the most affordable, but also the fastest and most hassle-free service for getting your music out to all major platforms, including Apple Music, Spotify, TikTok, Snapchat, and more. I've been using DistroKid for a few years now, not only for my own releases, my own beat tapes, but also for my clients. And one of the features that make it really easy to get going is Hyperfollow. Hyperfollow automatically creates a landing page for each release that you upload, and the best part is that it is dynamic. What this means is that before the release goes live, it serves as a great way to collect emails, pre-save on Spotify, and then direct them all to your social media platforms. Once the project is released, it automatically updates and starts to redirect people to listen to the project on their platform of choice. So then if you're ready to start reaching a broader audience with your music, then make sure to visit ivancalderon.com/distrokid or click the link down below for 7% off your first year. But that's it for me, friends. Hopefully this was helpful. And if you want to learn more about my drum workflow and why I love separation so much, then make sure to watch this video right over here. Thank you so much for your time, and I'll see you in the next video.